The smell reached Sheriff Augustus Marsh before he even dismounted his horse. It was a thick, sweet rot that hung in the humid Georgia air like a physical presence, mingling with the scent of magnolia blossoms and the earthy musk of the Savannah River marshlands. September mornings in the low country always carried a heaviness, but this was different. This was the unmistakable stench of death, and it had been ripening for at least 2 days. Deputy Elijah Newcomb gagged beside him, pulling a handkerchief to his face. The young man had only worn the badge for 6 months, and the greenish tint spreading across his features suggested this would be his first encounter with violent death. Marsh said nothing. Some lessons could only be learned through experience, and he suspected the education waiting inside the Holloway Plantation house would age his deputy considerably before noon. They had ridden hard from Milledgeville at first light, summoned by Percival Whitmore, who owned the neighboring tobacco plantation 3 miles east. Whitmore had appeared at the sheriff's office just after dawn, his clothes disheveled, his hands trembling as he tried to explain what he'd seen through the windows of the Holloway main house. The man had been nearly incoherent, his words tumbling over each other in fragments. Dining room. All of them. Still sitting. Something in their mouths. Blood everywhere. The slaves gone. All gone. Marsh had dismissed half of it as panic and exaggeration. Planters were prone to hysteria when it came to their enslaved workforce. A few runaways, perhaps a confrontation that had turned fatal, and Whitmore's imagination had done the rest. But as Marsh's boots touched the ground and he surveyed the Holloway estate, a cold stone of dread settled in his stomach. The plantation was silent. Not the peaceful quiet of a Sunday morning, but an oppressive, unnatural absence of sound. No voices called from the fields. No children played near the slave quarters visible in the distance. No workers moved along the dirt paths between buildings. The cotton field stretched toward the river, heavy with unpicked bolls that should have been swarming with laborers. Instead, only the cicadas sang, their rhythmic drone seeming to emphasize the wrongness of the scene. The main house rose before them, a 2-story structure of whitewashed wood with broad verandas and tall windows designed to catch any whisper of breeze. It was a testament to wealth built on brutality, and Marsh had been here before on official business. Jeremiah Holloway had been a man who believed firmly in the righteousness of his dominion, and he had ruled his property with an iron hand that even other planters found excessive. But Holloway had been within his legal rights, and the law protected property above all else. The front door stood open. Flies clustered around the entrance in a dense, buzzing cloud. Marsh drew his pistol, though he already knew whatever had happened here was long finished. Newcomb followed suit, his weapon trembling slightly in his grip. They climbed the steps slowly, the wood creaking under their weight. The buzz of flies grew louder, and Marsh could hear their deputy breathing in short, shallow gasps through the handkerchief still pressed to his face. The foyer was untouched. A grandfather clock stood against one wall, its pendulum still, frozen at 20 minutes past 9. A crystal chandelier caught the morning light filtering through the windows. Everything was in its place, pristine and orderly. But the smell was overwhelming now, and a trail of dark stains led across the polished wood floor toward the dining room. Marsh followed the trail. His throat felt tight, and he became aware of his own heartbeat thudding in his ears. Behind him, Newcomb made a small sound, something between a whimper and a prayer. The dining room doors were open wide. What Augustus Marsh saw in that moment would visit him in dreams for the rest of his life. 6 men sat around the long mahogany dining table, arranged as though they had simply paused in the middle of conversation. 6 men in dining chairs, their hands resting on the armrests, their bodies held upright by ropes lashed around their torsos. 6 men who had been dead for at least 48 hours, judging by the extent of bloating and discoloration visible on their exposed skin. But it was not the fact of their death that made Marsh's vision swim and his stomach heave. It was what had been done to them. Each man had an iron bit hammered through his jaw. Marsh knew what slave bits were. Every lawman in Georgia knew. They were cruel contraptions of iron and leather, designed to punish enslaved people who spoke out of turn, who sang without permission, who dared to use their voices in ways their masters found objectionable. A cage of metal forced into the mouth, with an iron plate pressed against the tongue to prevent speech. Some had spikes that would pierce the tongue if the wearer tried to talk. They were locked in place with leather straps that buckled behind the head. But these bits had been modified into instruments of execution. The iron tongues had been driven deep, hammered with such force that they had shattered teeth and bone, penetrating through the roof of the mouth and into the skull cavity. Blood had poured from the wounds, soaking the men's shirt fronts, pooling on the table surface, dripping onto the oriental rug below. The leather straps were still buckled tight, locked with small padlocks that kept the devices fixed in place. The men's eyes were open, bulging with the final terror of their deaths. Their hands showed defensive wounds, rope burns on the wrists suggesting they had been bound during the ordeal. Marsh recognized Jeremiah Holloway immediately, seated at the head of the table in his customary position of authority. The plantation master's face was frozen in a rictus of agony, the iron bit protruding from his mouth like an obscene tongue. To his right sat his eldest son, Thaddeus Holloway, a man of 30 who had inherited his father's taste for cruelty. To the left was Cornelius Holloway, the younger son, only 22, whose reputation for violence toward the enslaved had been building for years. The three other men Marsh recognized as overseers. David Crawford, a thick-necked brute who had worked in Holloway land for 15 years. Nathaniel Webb, newer to the plantation but known in the county for his liberal use of the whip. And Edmund Grimshaw, a man with dead eyes who had once been run out of South Carolina for killing an enslaved man in a fit of rage. All six sat in judgment now, or perhaps in mockery of judgment, arranged around the table like dinner guests interrupted mid-meal. Decanters of whiskey sat on the table, along with glasses that had been knocked over, their contents long since dried. Plates held the remains of what had been an evening meal, now spoiled and covered with flies. Behind Marsh, Deputy Newcomb finally lost his battle with his stomach and stumbled back into the foyer, the sounds of his retching echoing through the silent house. Marsh forced himself to move closer, to examine the scene with the professional detachment his position required, though his hands shook and cold sweat had broken out across his back. The bits themselves told a story. They were identical to each other, clearly made by the same hand, and they bore the marks of the Holloway forge. Someone had crafted these instruments specifically for this purpose, and had modified them from tools of punishment into weapons of execution. The symbolism was impossible to miss. The masters who had used these devices to silence others had been silenced permanently, their mouths filled with iron, their voices stolen forever. It was poetic in its horror, methodical in its revenge. Marsh walked slowly around the table, forcing himself to observe every detail. The ropes that bound the men to their chairs were professional sailors' knots. The hammer blows that had driven the bits home had been delivered with precision, angled upward through the jaw to pierce the brain. Death would not have been instant, but it would have been inevitable. The men had died slowly, drowning in their own blood, unable to scream through the iron filling their mouths. The house beyond the dining room was undisturbed. Marsh checked room after room, finding beds made, possessions in place, no signs of looting or chaos. Whoever had done this had come for a specific purpose and had left once that purpose was fulfilled. The only thing missing was people. The slave quarters, when Marsh finally forced himself to walk down to inspect them, were empty. Cabins stood with doors open, a few possessions scattered as though the inhabitants had left in a hurry but not in panic. They had taken food, blankets, and tools. They had taken the children and the elderly. This had been planned, organized, executed with military precision. Augustus Marsh stood in the center of the abandoned quarters, surrounded by the silence of absence, and felt the weight of understanding settle on his shoulders. This was not random violence. This was not the wild uprising that planters feared in their nightmares. This was calculated justice, as terrible and absolute as the system that had birthed it. Someone had decided that Jeremiah Holloway and his men would die exactly as they had made others suffer. Someone had orchestrated their torture with the same cold deliberation that Holloway had used in running his plantation. And now that someone, along with every enslaved person who had lived and worked this land, had vanished into the vast expanse of Georgia wilderness. The implications made Marsh's head spin. The questions that would come from Milledgeville, from Savannah, from plantation owners across the county. The demands for swift justice, for examples to be made, for the restoration of order. But as he stood in that empty quarter, looking at the small gardens the enslaved had tended, the makeshift crosses marking graves of children who had not survived their bondage, Marsh felt something he had never expected to feel as an officer of the law. He felt that perhaps, just this once, justice had been served. If you're captivated by this dark chapter of hidden history, make sure you're subscribed to the channel and hit that notification bell. The story of what led to this gruesome discovery is far more terrifying than what Sheriff Marsh found in that dining room, and you won't want to miss what comes next. Let's continue into the past, to the months leading up to that September morning, and discover exactly what kind of hell Holloway Plantation truly was. 6 months before Sheriff Augustus Marsh would walk into that dining room of horrors, Holloway Plantation thrived in the cruel prosperity that defined the antebellum South. The estate sprawled across 800 acres of prime Georgia bottomland, stretching from the red clay hills down to the rich black soil near the Savannah River. Cotton grew in endless rows, white bowls bursting open under the relentless sun, each field representing wealth built on broken backs and stolen lives. Jeremiah Holloway was a third-generation planter, born into brutality and raised to view it as natural order. His grandfather had carved this empire from wilderness in 1785, and his father had expanded it through calculated marriages and ruthless business practices. By the time Jeremiah inherited the property in 1828, the Holloway name was spoken with a mixture of respect and fear throughout the county. Respect for the cotton yields that made him wealthy. Fear for the methods he employed to achieve them. The main house sat on a small rise, positioned so that Jeremiah could survey his domain from the second-floor veranda. He took his coffee there each morning, watching the field workers move into position as the sun rose, counting heads to ensure no one had attempted escape during the night. His sons would join him, Thaddeus discussing the day's work assignments while Cornelius cleaned his rifle, occasionally taking practice shots at crows that had the misfortune to land too close to the house. March of 1844 had brought an early heat to the low country, the kind of oppressive warmth that made the air shimmer above the cotton fields and turned the work of picking into a form of slow torture. The quota system Jeremiah employed was simple and merciless. Each adult was expected to pick 150 pounds of cotton per day. Children over the age of 8 were expected to manage 75 pounds. Anyone who failed to meet their quota would be punished. The punishments varied according to Jeremiah's mood and his assessment of the offense. The whip was common, applied with methodical precision by the overseers who competed to demonstrate their loyalty and efficiency. But Jeremiah had developed a particular fondness for a different form of correction, one he considered more civilized than the brutal scars left by leather on flesh. He preferred the slave bit. The device itself was deceptively simple. An iron framework that fit over the head, with a flat piece of metal designed to press down on the tongue. Leather straps buckled behind the skull to hold it in place, and a small padlock ensured it could not be removed without permission. Some versions included spikes or serrated edges that would cut the tongue if the wearer attempted to speak. Jeremiah owned a collection of 12 such devices, kept in the overseer's quarters and brought out as needed. The brilliance of the bit, in Jeremiah's estimation, was its psychological impact. It prevented speech, yes, but more than that, it prevented eating, drinking, swallowing. It transformed the mouth into a prison, every breath labored, every moment a reminder of powerlessness. A person could be bit for hours, for days, standing in the sun with iron in their mouth while their tongue swelled and their throat burned with thirst. The punishment left no visible scars, nothing that would reduce a person's value at auction, but it broke spirits with remarkable efficiency. Samuel Graves knew the bits intimately. As the plantation's blacksmith, he worked in the forge near the main barn, his days spent shoeing horses, repairing tools, and maintaining the various instruments that kept the plantation functioning. This included the slave bits. When leather straps rotted from sweat and weather, Samuel replaced them. When iron frames bent or broke, Samuel repaired them. When Jeremiah decided he wanted modifications, a longer tongue plate or sharper spikes, Samuel made them to specification. The irony was not lost on him. His hands, strong and skilled from years at the forge, created the very tools used to torture his people. But Samuel had learned long ago that survival required compromise, that open rebellion led only to death, and that patience was a weapon that could be sharpened in secret. He was 43 years old, born on this plantation to parents whose names he barely remembered. He had watched generations of Holloways perfect their cruelty, and he had learned to watch with careful, calculating eyes. Benjamin Cross worked the cotton fields, his back crisscrossed with scars from 15 years of labor under the Georgia sun. He was 31 years old, with hands so calloused they seemed made of leather, and a voice that could carry across the fields in song despite the danger such singing invited. Benjamin had been sold to Holloway in 1829, separated from his wife and infant daughter in a transaction he had been powerless to prevent. The grief of that loss had hardened into something cold and patient inside his chest, a coal that never quite cooled but burned with steady, controlled heat. Moses Harper moved through the main house like a ghost, a house servant of 52 who had cultivated an appearance of subservience so complete that the Holloways discussed their business openly in his presence. They did not see him as a person capable of thought or memory. They saw him as furniture, as useful and unremarkable as the sideboard where he arranged their meals. Moses heard everything. He remembered everything. And at night, in the quarters, he shared everything with those who needed to know. Charlotte Reed commanded the kitchen, a domain of cast iron and fire where she transformed the plantation's provisions into meals for the main house. She was 38 years old, broad-shouldered and powerful, with hands that could break a chicken's neck or knead bread with equal efficiency. Her face bore the mark of the bit on the left side, where the iron frame had once been locked so tightly it had left permanent indentations in her cheek. She had worn the device for 3 days after Overseer David Crawford accused her of speaking disrespectfully while serving dinner. The bits had damaged something in her jaw that never quite healed, leaving her with a slight slur in her speech and chronic pain that flared in cold weather. Grace Thornton worked as the plantation seamstress, her needle flying through fabric as she mended the Holloway family's clothing and created the rough garments distributed to the field workers twice yearly. She was 29 years old, small and delicate in appearance, which had proven to be a curse rather than a blessing. Cornelius Holloway had noticed her when she was 16, and she had borne 2 children as a result of his attentions. The first, a boy, had been sold away at age 5 when Jeremiah decided the child was too light-skinned and might cause talk among visiting planters. The second, her daughter Naomi, was 12 years old and worked in the main house helping Moses with the lighter cleaning duties. Young Daniel Pierce tended the horses in the plantation stables, a boy of 17 with a gift for calming even the most temperamental animals. He had been born on the plantation to a mother who had died of fever when he was 8, and he carried her memory like a talisman, the only warmth in a world that had shown him primarily coldness. Daniel dreamed of escape, whispered about the North in conversations with Benjamin, and lived in a state of constant fear that his dreams would be discovered and crushed. These were the core of what would come to be known, in whispered legend, as the Holloway Six. But they were only 6 among 137 souls who worked the plantation's fields and buildings, who endured its brutalities, who survived from day to day with the knowledge that they were considered property under the law, that they could be bought, sold, bred, or killed at the whim of men who viewed them as less than human. The plantation's isolation ensured that such whims could be indulged without consequence. Milledgeville was 15 miles northwest, accessible by a rutted road that became impassable after heavy rains. The neighboring plantations were owned by men who shared Jeremiah's philosophy, who competed with each other for cotton yields and compared notes on management techniques with the same casual interest they brought to discussing horse breeding. The law existed to protect property, and the enslaved were property. The system was designed to be perfect in its oppression, total in its control. But systems built on violence contain within them the seeds of their own destruction. And in March of 1844, those seeds were already germinating in the red Georgia soil, watered by blood and tears, reaching toward a terrible harvest. Samuel worked his forge, his hammer ringing against iron, and thought about the slave bits hanging on the wall of Overseer Crawford's quarters. He thought about the modifications he could make, the ways a punishment device could be transformed into something else entirely. He thought about justice, and revenge, and the fine line between the two. Benjamin sang softly in the cotton fields, songs that sounded like spirituals but carried coded messages about patience and preparation, about watching for the right moment, about the North Star that hung in the sky each night like a promise. Moses moved through the main house, invisible and all-seeing, gathering information about schedules and habits, about when the overseers drank themselves into stupor and when Jeremiah would be hosting visitors. Charlotte worked her kitchen, her damaged jaw a constant reminder of what had been done to her, and thought about all the ways food could be more than sustenance. Grace sewed in her small room, each stitch a meditation on what she would do to protect her remaining child, the only piece of her heart she had left. And young Daniel tended his horses, feeding them and brushing their coats, preparing them without quite realizing it for a long journey north. The Holloway Plantation turned with the rhythms of cotton and cruelty, and its masters believed themselves secure in their dominion. They believed the silence they enforced with bits and whips and chains was real silence, the absence of thought and will. They did not understand that silence could be a strategy, that submission could be a mask, that the iron they forced into mouths could one day be returned with interest. March gave way to April, and April to May. The cotton grew tall in the fields. The sun beat down with increasing ferocity. And beneath the surface of enforced order, something began to stir, patient and implacable as the river that flowed past the plantation boundaries, carrying whispers of freedom toward the distant sea. The slave bits hung on iron hooks in the overseer's quarters, arranged in a row like trophies or tools awaiting use. Samuel Graves had occasion to see them often, called to repair a bent frame or replace rotted leather, and each visit reinforced his intimate knowledge of their construction. There were 12 in total, ranging from the oldest, a simple iron cage dating back to Jeremiah's father's time, to the newest acquisitions that featured refinements in cruelty. Some had smooth tongue plates. Others bore sharp ridges designed to cut if the wearer attempted to speak or swallow. The newest edition, commissioned by Jeremiah just 2 months prior, included small spikes that would pierce the tongue from below, ensuring that even the involuntary movements of breathing became exercises in pain. Samuel had made that one himself, working from Jeremiah's specifications, his hands moving with practiced skill while his mind turned over darker thoughts. He understood the mechanics of the device with perfect clarity. The weight distribution that kept the frame stable on the head. The angle of the tongue plate that maximized discomfort while preventing the wearer from biting down hard enough to break their own teeth in desperation. The placement of the buckles that made removal impossible without the key. Every detail had been explained to him, refined through his craftsmanship, perfected through his labor. And with each bit he repaired or created, Samuel learned. He learned how much force was required to bend the iron. He learned which angles would cause the frame to fail under pressure. He learned, most importantly, how such a device could be modified from an instrument of temporary torture into something far more permanent. The education proved valuable sooner than he anticipated. Charlotte Reed's punishment came on a humid evening in late April, when the air hung thick enough to choke on and tempers ran short in the main house. She had been serving dinner to Jeremiah and his sons, moving silently around the table with platters of roasted pork and spring vegetables, when Thaddeus made a comment about the meat being overcooked. Charlotte, tired from 14 hours in the sweltering kitchen, made the fatal mistake of defending her cooking. She did not raise her voice. She did not speak disrespectfully. She simply stated, in measured tones, that the pork had been cooked to the same temperature as always, and perhaps the master's palate was affected by the whiskey he had been drinking since mid-afternoon. The silence that followed was absolute. Thaddeus's face darkened to the color of old blood. Jeremiah set down his fork with deliberate care. And Cornelius smiled, the expression of a man anticipating entertainment. David Crawford was summoned. The overseer arrived within minutes, his heavy boots tracking mud across the dining room floor. Jeremiah issued his instructions in the same tone he might use to order a horse saddled. 3 days in the bit. No removal for any reason. Post her where the field workers can see her on their way to the cotton. Let it be a lesson about the proper boundaries of speech. Crawford selected one of the older bits, iron dark with age and use, the leather strap stiff but functional. He forced it into Charlotte's mouth while Thaddeus and Cornelius watched from the table, continuing their meal as though the scene unfolding before them was no more remarkable than swatting a fly. The iron plate pressed down on Charlotte's tongue, the frame locked around her head, the straps buckled tight and secured with a small padlock. Crawford pulled the straps tighter than necessary, his thick fingers working the leather until Charlotte's eyes watered and her breathing became labored gasps through her nose. They tied her to a post near the path that led from the quarters to the fields, her hands bound behind her back, her body positioned so that every worker would pass within feet of her on their way to labor. The April night was warm, but by morning the sun would turn that post into an instrument of torture as effective as the bit itself. Samuel walked past her in the pre-dawn darkness, on his way to light the forge fires. Charlotte's eyes found his in the dim light, and what he saw there was not a plea for help or even pain. It was rage, pure and incandescent, burning behind the exhaustion and physical suffering. She could not speak. She could not swallow the saliva that gathered in her mouth and dripped down her chin. She could barely breathe. But her eyes spoke volumes, and Samuel heard every word. Benjamin passed her an hour later, leading his work gang toward the cotton fields. He did not stop, could not stop without inviting punishment himself, but he sang as he walked. A spiritual about Moses leading his people out of bondage, the words carefully chosen, the meaning clear to those who knew how to listen. Charlotte's eyes tracked him, and though she could not join the song, something in her posture straightened, a silent affirmation that she heard and understood. Grace brought her daughter past on the way to the main house for Naomi's morning duties. The girl started to cry at the sight of Charlotte's suffering, and Grace had to grip her shoulder hard, fingers digging in, to prevent the child from running to the woman's aid. They walked on, but Grace's lips moved in silent prayer, or perhaps in silent promise. The distinction between the two was becoming increasingly blurred. Moses, ever observant, noted the reaction of the other house servants. The kitchen would be without its leader for at least 3 days, possibly longer if Charlotte's jaw sustained damage that prevented her from working. He mentally catalogued the disruption this would cause, the gaps in routine that might be exploited, the moments when attention would be divided. Information was a form of currency, and Moses was a wealthy man in ways his masters could never comprehend. Young Daniel came last, bringing water for the horses pastured in the near field. He was only 17, but he had seen enough suffering in his short life to understand what 3 days in the bit under the Georgia sun would mean. He had seen his mother die of fever, watched friends sold away to the deep South plantations where survival was measured in months rather than years, witnessed beatings, and worse. But something about Charlotte's situation struck him with particular force. Perhaps it was the casual nature of her offense. Perhaps it was the methodical cruelty of the punishment. Or perhaps it was simply that he had reached the age where witnessing injustice transforms from learned helplessness into determination for change. The first day was torture. The sun rose and beat down on Charlotte with relentless intensity. Flies gathered around the saliva that dripped from her mouth and the sweat that poured from her face. She could not wipe them away. Could not drink the water that workers carried past her to the fields. Could not call out or beg or even weep properly with the iron filling her mouth. By noon, she swayed on her feet, only the ropes holding her upright. By evening, her tongue had swollen around the iron plate, and the leather straps had rubbed raw patches on her cheeks and behind her ears. Overseer Nathaniel Webb checked on her twice, ensuring she remained conscious, pouring a small amount of water over her head not from mercy but from the practical concern that dead property had no value as an example. He laughed as the water ran down her face and she tried desperately to catch some with her tongue, an impossible task with the bit in place. The second day brought delirium. Charlotte's eyes lost focus, her body hanging almost entirely from the ropes now. Other workers whispered prayers as they passed, careful to keep their voices low enough that the overseers would not hear. Samuel brought food to Crawford's quarters and noted that the overseer was drinking heavily, a habit that intensified in the evenings. Benjamin noticed that Edmund Grimshaw had taken to riding out to inspect a distant property line each afternoon, leaving his section of the plantation less carefully supervised for several hours. Grace observed that Cornelius Holloway had developed a pattern of visiting the neighboring Whitmore plantation 3 times weekly, courting the daughter there, his absence creating predictable gaps in the house's security. They did not speak of these observations openly. They did not need to. The quarters at night were a place of coded communication, where spirituals carried messages and silence spoke as loudly as words. A community that had survived through enforced submission had learned to coordinate through means invisible to their oppressors. The 3rd day, Charlotte's body began to fail. Her kidneys, stressed by dehydration and heat, caused her urine to run dark and bloody down her legs. Her jaw had locked around the iron plate, the muscles cramping into positions that would leave permanent damage. Her breathing became shallow and irregular. Webb, checking on her at noon, seemed disappointed that she remained alive, that the punishment had not escalated into a death that would have provided additional intimidation value. It was Samuel who finally cut her down at sunset of the 3rd day, Crawford having drunk himself into a stupor and forgotten the scheduled release. He worked the lock with the key the overseer kept hanging by the door, then carefully unbuckled the leather straps. The bit came away slowly, Charlotte's jaw muscles refusing to release even when the pressure was removed. Samuel had to work her mouth open gently, and when the iron finally pulled free, it was slick with blood and saliva and the evidence of 3 days of silent agony. Charlotte collapsed into his arms, unable to stand. Her jaw hung wrong, something broken or dislocated in the joint. She tried to speak and only a wet, rattling sound emerged, her damaged tongue unable to form words. Samuel carried her to her cabin, laid her on her pallet, and brought water that she could barely swallow. Grace came to tend her, washing the wounds, applying poultices made from herbs grown in secret gardens, whispering comfort that Charlotte probably could not hear through the fog of pain and exhaustion. It took 2 weeks before Charlotte could eat solid food again. A month before she could speak clearly, though her words forever carried a slight slur where the bit had permanently damaged the left side of her jaw. The mark of the iron frame remained visible on her cheek, a brand more permanent than any applied with hot metal. And in the forge, working late into the night by the light of the dying coals, Samuel Graves began to modify a collection of slave bits, changing their angles, lengthening their iron tongues, transforming them from instruments of temporary punishment into weapons of permanent silence. He worked with the patience of a man who understood that vengeance, like iron, must be properly tempered to achieve its full strength. The cruelty of Holloway Plantation is becoming clear, but the worst is yet to come. Drop a comment below and tell me what you think should happen to men like Jeremiah Holloway and his overseers. Justice delayed is not justice denied, and this story is far from over. Let's continue to the breaking point, to the moment when patience transforms into action, and silence becomes the loudest scream of all. August descended on the Georgia low country like a living thing, oppressive and malevolent, turning the air into something that had to be chewed before it could be breathed. The cotton fields shimmered with heat mirages, and the work of picking became a form of slow suffocation. By mid-afternoon, the temperature regularly exceeded 100 degrees, and the humidity made every movement feel like wading through warm water. This was the season when the strong faltered and the weak perished, when heat exhaustion claimed lives with casual efficiency, when masters pushed their human property to the breaking point and sometimes beyond, driven by the need to harvest the crop before the autumn rains came. Jeremiah Holloway increased the daily quotas. 175 pounds per adult. 90 pounds for the children. Anyone who failed would spend the night in the bit, working the next day with iron in their mouth, the punishment compounding until they met the requirement or collapsed. It was a system designed to extract maximum labor through maximum fear, and it had worked for 3 generations of Holloways. There was no reason to believe it would fail now. Naomi Thornton was 12 years old, small for her age, with her mother's delicate bone structure and her father's gray eyes. Cornelius had never acknowledged paternity, but the resemblance was obvious enough that the other enslaved people referred to her privately as one of the master's shadow children, those born from violence and exploitation but granted no recognition or privilege. She worked in the main house alongside Moses, dusting furniture and washing windows and performing the dozens of small tasks that kept a plantation household running. She was quick and quiet, had learned early to make herself invisible when the Holloway men were in foul moods, and had survived 12 years through a combination of her mother's protective vigilance and her own careful navigation of a world designed to destroy her. Her mistake came on a sweltering afternoon in late August, when the heat had driven most of the household to seek shade and cool drinks on the veranda. Naomi was cleaning Thaddeus's study, a room lined with books that represented education and culture the enslaved were forbidden to access. As she dusted the massive oak desk, she noticed a newspaper left open, its headline speaking of railroad expansions and political debates in distant Washington. The words called to her with a magnetic pull she could not entirely explain or resist. She had seen letters before, knew the shapes they made on the page, but she had never been taught to decode their meanings. The prohibition against literacy for the enslaved was absolute, enforced by law and violence. To read was to access power, to think beyond the boundaries established by masters, to imagine possibilities outside the plantation's borders. It was, therefore, the most dangerous skill a slave could possess. Naomi bent over the newspaper, her finger tracing the large letters of the headline, sounding out the shapes in a whisper so quiet it barely qualified as breath. She did not hear David Crawford enter the room behind her. Did not sense his presence until his massive hand clamped down on her shoulder, spinning her around with force that sent her sprawling to the floor. "What are you doing, girl?" Crawford's voice was thick with the afternoon whiskey he consumed in quantities that would have felled a smaller man. His face was flushed, sweat staining his shirt, and his eyes held the particular cruelty of a man who had found an opportunity to demonstrate his authority. Naomi tried to stammer an explanation, but Crawford was already bellowing for Jeremiah, his voice carrying through the house like a summons to judgment. Within minutes, the study filled with people. Jeremiah appeared first, followed by Thaddeus and then Cornelius, drawn by the commotion. Moses materialized in the doorway, his face carefully blank, but his eyes tracking every detail of the scene. And Grace came running from the sewing room, her heart already breaking because she knew with terrible certainty that whatever was happening to her daughter would be catastrophic. Crawford explained what he had witnessed, embellishing the details, claiming Naomi had been studying the newspaper with the clear intent to learn reading, that she had been sounding out words and showing obvious comprehension. Whether this was true or exaggeration hardly mattered. The accusation itself was enough. Jeremiah studied the girl with the same expression he might use when examining a horse that had thrown a shoe. Thoughtful. Calculating. Weighing options and consequences. Grace fell to her knees, begging with a desperation that she knew was futile but could not suppress. She offered to take the punishment herself, promised that Naomi would never touch a book or newspaper again, swore on everything she held sacred that the child meant no harm. Her pleas fell on deaf ears. Jeremiah had rules, and those rules maintained order. The rules stated clearly that any attempt to achieve literacy was to be punished severely, as an example to others who might harbor similar ambitions. The fact that Naomi was 12 years old, that she was technically his granddaughter though he would never acknowledge it, that she had committed no crime beyond curiosity, none of these factors warranted consideration. "Take her to the post," Jeremiah said, his tone conversational, as though ordering a cup of tea. "Bit her. Full sun exposure. Remove at sunset. That should be sufficient to reinforce the lesson." Grace's scream was incoherent, a sound of pure maternal anguish. Moses stepped forward, attempting to intercede, to suggest alternative punishments, but Thaddeus struck him across the face with the back of his hand, sending the older man stumbling against the doorframe. "Know your place, Moses." Cornelius watched the scene with his characteristic smile, the expression that suggested he found the suffering of others more entertaining than any theatrical performance. "Fetch one of the newer bits, father. The one with the tongue spikes. Make sure she remembers this." Crawford dragged Naomi from the house, the girl too terrified even to cry now, her body rigid with shock. Grace tried to follow, but Edmund Grimshaw appeared to restrain her, his arms wrapping around her chest, holding her back while she thrashed and wailed. The other house servants stood frozen, unable to help, knowing that any intervention would result in their own punishment. The post stood in its usual location, a thick column of pine wood driven deep into the red Georgia clay. Crawford selected one of the newer bits from his quarters, the device gleaming in the afternoon sun, its iron tongue fitted with 3 small spikes designed to pierce flesh at the slightest movement. He forced it into Naomi's mouth with casual brutality, ignoring her choked gasps and the tears streaming down her face. The leather straps buckled tight. The lock clicked closed. And then the girl was tied to the post, her small body barely reaching halfway up its height, her arms bound behind her back, positioned so that she faced east where the sun would track across her face for the remaining hours of the afternoon. The August heat was monstrous. Within the first hour, Naomi's face had turned bright red, sweat pouring from her skin. Within 2 hours, she had stopped struggling against her bonds, her body hanging limp, supported only by the ropes. Her tongue, pierced by the spikes, bled steadily, the blood mixing with saliva and dripping from the bit's framework. She could not swallow. Could not call for help. Could barely breathe through her nose as panic constricted her airways. Grace was locked in her cabin, Grimshaw standing guard outside to ensure she did not attempt to help her daughter. She could hear nothing from inside, but her imagination painted pictures more terrible than any reality. She prayed to a God she sometimes doubted existed, bargaining with the universe, offering her own life in exchange for her child's, making promises she knew she could never keep because the world they inhabited did not operate on principles of fairness or mercy. Benjamin passed the post on his way back from the far fields, his work gang marching in tired formation. He saw Naomi hanging there, saw the bit gleaming in the sun, saw the small pool of bloody saliva that had formed at her feet. He sang as he passed, a spiritual about children safe in the arms of angels, and his voice cracked on the final verse. The other workers joined him, their voices rising in harmony, a small act of witnessing that was also an act of futile rebellion. Samuel saw her when Crawford called him to examine a broken plow blade. He approached close enough to observe the rise and fall of her chest, irregular and shallow, and the way her eyes had rolled back to show mostly whites. He knew the signs of severe heat exhaustion, had seen them before in field workers pushed beyond human endurance. The girl was dying, and there was nothing he could do to stop it without bringing punishment on himself that would prevent him from doing anything at all in the future. Young Daniel brought water for the overseers at their evening gathering, serving them with the invisible efficiency expected of his position. He heard them laugh about the girl at the post, making wagers about whether she would survive until sunset. Edmund Grimshaw bet $5 she would be dead by evening. Nathaniel Webb gave her until midnight. David Crawford, already drunk, claimed she would last until morning because children were hardier than they appeared. Their laughter followed Daniel as he left the quarters, and something inside his chest turned to ice. Moses moved through the main house preparing dinner, his hands moving through familiar routines while his mind worked on darker calculations. He observed that Jeremiah and his sons would be dining alone tonight, that the overseers were all gathered in Crawford's quarters drinking, that the plantation's usual routines had been disrupted by the day's events. He filed these observations away with all the others he had accumulated over decades of careful watching. The sun tracked west, sinking toward the tree line. Naomi stopped moving entirely around 4 in the afternoon, her body completely limp against the ropes. By 5, her breathing had become almost imperceptible. By 6, when the sun finally dropped below the horizon and cast long shadows across the plantation grounds, she was gone. Crawford cut her down at Jeremiah's instruction, checking for a pulse in her wrist and finding none. He shrugged, unbuckled the bit from her cooling face, and carried her small body to the quarters where he dumped it unceremoniously in front of Grace's cabin. Accident of the heat, he reported to Jeremiah. Weak constitution. Not the bit's fault, just bad luck. Grace's keening wail carried across the plantation, a sound of grief so profound it seemed to tear holes in the fabric of the evening air. She cradled Naomi's body, rocking back and forth, her damaged jaw working around words that came out broken and incomplete. Her daughter's face was peaceful in death, the terror smoothed away, but the marks of the bit remained on her cheeks and the small puncture wounds on her tongue still oozed blood. Samuel came to the cabin after full dark, after the main house had gone quiet and the overseers had drunk themselves into stupor. He found Grace still rocking her child, still keening that terrible sound. Benjamin was there, and Moses, Charlotte, and Daniel. Others gathered in the shadows, the quarters filling with silent witnesses to a grief that could not be contained or comforted. Samuel knelt beside Grace, placed his large blacksmith's hands on her shoulders, and spoke words that would change everything. No more. His voice was quiet but carried the weight of absolute conviction. No more children dying for their curiosity. No more mothers watching their babies tortured. No more silence while they destroy us piece by piece. We end this. We end them. The others looked at him, seeing something in his face that had not been there before, or perhaps had always been there but was only now being revealed. Grace raised her tear-streaked face, her damaged jaw set in a line of terrible resolve. When? September 1st, Samuel said. Jeremiah is hosting dinner for the overseers. They will all be in the main house, drinking and celebrating the cotton yield. They will be together, in one place, confident in their safety. We will show them what their instruments of torture feel like. We will silence them the way they have silenced us. And then we leave this place forever. One by one, the others nodded. Benjamin, whose scars burned with remembered pain. Moses, whose decades of observation had taught him exactly how to exploit the master's weaknesses. Charlotte, whose jaw still clicked wrong when she spoke. Daniel, whose youth made him more willing to risk everything for a chance at freedom. And Grace, holding her dead daughter, whose grief had transformed into something harder and colder than iron. They spent the night planning while the plantation slept around them, oblivious to the storm gathering in its heart. Samuel described the modifications he had made to the bits, the changes that would transform temporary punishment into permanent silence. Moses detailed the schedules and habits of the Holloways and their overseers, the moments of vulnerability that could be exploited. Benjamin organized work assignments that would position key people in strategic locations on September 1st. Charlotte discussed the herbs she could add to the evening meal, nothing that would kill but substances that would slow reactions and dull senses. As dawn approached and they prepared to return to their assigned positions, to resume the performance of submission they had perfected over lifetimes of survival, Samuel made them all swear an oath. They would tell no one else. They would show no change in behavior. They would endure whatever the next 10 days brought with the knowledge that an ending was coming. And when September 1st arrived, they would show no mercy, because mercy had never been shown to them or their children. Grace requested one thing. That she be allowed to hold the hammer when it came time to apply the bits. That her hands be the ones to drive iron through the jaws of the men who had killed her daughter. Samuel agreed, understanding that some wounds could only be healed through the application of justice, and that justice, when too long delayed, became indistinguishable from revenge. They buried Naomi before sunrise in the small plot behind the quarters where generations of enslaved people rested in unmarked graves. There was no marker, no ceremony beyond the whispered prayers of her community. But her death became the spark that ignited a powder keg that had been filling for decades, and her name would be remembered by those who survived long after the names of her killers had been forgotten by history. The Holloway Plantation continued its routines, cotton picked and processed, meals served and cleaned, horses tended and fields maintained. To any observer, nothing had changed. But beneath the surface, in the careful exchanges of glances and the coded words of spirituals sung in the fields, a countdown had begun. 10 days until September 1st. 10 days until silence was answered with silence, iron with iron, cruelty with the terrible arithmetic of justice too long denied. September 1st arrived with a breathless humidity that pressed down on the plantation like a physical weight, the air thick with the promise of storms that never quite materialized. The cotton fields lay heavy with the season's final picking, and Jeremiah Holloway moved through his morning routines with the satisfaction of a man surveying his profitable domain. The yield would be exceptional this year, his wealth secured for another season, his position in county society reinforced. He had invited David Crawford, Nathaniel Webb, and Edmund Grimshaw to dinner that evening, a celebration of their collective success and a distribution of the bonuses he paid his overseers for exceptional crop production. The day progressed with mechanical normalcy. Field workers moved through the cotton rows, their hands working with the practiced efficiency of decades. Samuel worked his forge, the ring of his hammer on iron carrying across the grounds in steady rhythm. Moses prepared the main house for the evening's dinner, polishing silver and arranging the dining room with meticulous care. Charlotte worked in the kitchen, preparing roasted duck and sweet potatoes and the cornbread Jeremiah favored, her damaged jaw set in concentration as she moved between oven and preparation table. Grace sewed in her small room, her needle flying through fabric, her thoughts far from the work at hand. Daniel tended horses in the stable, brushing their coats until they gleamed, checking their shoes and harnesses with unusual attention to detail. To any observer, it was simply another day on Holloway Plantation. But those who knew how to read the signs would have noticed small anomalies. The way certain workers positioned themselves near specific buildings as sunset approached. The way tools had been moved from their usual storage locations. The way Moses had laid out the dining room with particular care, ensuring each chair was positioned precisely, each place setting arranged just so. The dinner began at 7, as the sun sank toward the tree line and cast long shadows across the grounds. Jeremiah sat at the head of the table, his sons Thaddeus and Cornelius flanking him on either side. The three overseers took their positions along the table's length, Crawford across from Webb, Grimshaw at the far end. Moses served the first course, moving with his characteristic silent efficiency, his weathered face betraying nothing as he poured whiskey into crystal glasses. The whiskey was from Jeremiah's private stock, aged bourbon he reserved for special occasions. It had a slightly different taste tonight, a subtle bitterness beneath the honey sweetness, but the men around the table were already 3 drinks deep from their pre-dinner gathering and noticed nothing amiss. Charlotte had been careful with her measurements, adding just enough jimsonweed tincture to slow reactions without inducing obvious symptoms. The herb was common in the Georgia lowlands, used in small doses for various medicinal purposes, but in larger quantities it produced confusion, sluggish movement, and a dreamlike dissociation from reality. The conversation flowed with the alcohol, the men discussing cotton prices and political developments, boasting about their management techniques and sharing crude jokes. They spoke freely in front of Moses, their words slurred and their guards completely lowered. They did not notice when Benjamin appeared briefly in the doorway, catching Moses's eye and giving a slight nod. They did not observe when Samuel passed by one of the dining room windows, his silhouette visible for just a moment against the darkening sky. They were masters in their domain, secure in their power, and they had no reason to suspect that the very air they breathed was thick with approaching retribution. By 8 o'clock, the effects of Charlotte's preparation were becoming evident. Crawford's words slurred more than usual, his head nodding between sentences. Webb blinked slowly, as though fighting sleep. Grimshaw stared at his plate with unusual concentration, struggling to focus. Jeremiah frowned, feeling a strange lethargy creeping through his limbs, but attributed it to the heat and the richness of the meal. Thaddeus and Cornelius seemed similarly affected, their usual sharp cruelty dulled to sluggish confusion. Moses refilled their glasses one final time, then stepped back toward the kitchen door. The signal was subtle, just a slight shift in posture, but those watching for it understood. The time had come. They entered through multiple doors simultaneously, their coordination perfect from days of planning. Samuel through the front entrance, Benjamin and Daniel through the kitchen, Grace and Charlotte from the servants' hallway. Others appeared behind them, field workers who had been positioned throughout the house and grounds. The masters looked up from their meal with confused, slow-moving surprise, their drugged minds struggling to process the impossibility of what they were seeing. Crawford tried to stand but his legs would not cooperate properly. He reached for the pistol he kept in his belt, but Benjamin was faster, striking him across the temple with the butt of a heavy iron poker taken from the parlor fireplace. The overseer crumpled, unconscious but alive. Webb managed to rise halfway before Daniel tackled him from behind, bearing him to the floor with the weight of 17 years of suppressed rage. Grimshaw actually made it to his feet, stumbling toward the door, but Samuel caught him with one massive blacksmith's hand, lifting the man and throwing him bodily back into his chair. Jeremiah bellowed, his voice still carrying authority even through the fog of Jimsonweed. He lunged toward his sons, perhaps to protect them or rally them to action, but Moses stepped forward and brought a cast-iron skillet down on the master's head with a crack that echoed through the room. Jeremiah fell, blood streaming from his scalp, but conscious, his eyes wide with incomprehension. Thaddeus tried to fight, his fists swinging wildly, but Charlotte stepped in close and drove a kitchen knife into his thigh, deep enough to cripple but not to kill. Not yet. Cornelius, always the most vicious, managed to draw a knife from his boot and slashed at Grace, opening a long cut across her forearm. She barely flinched, stepping inside his guard and bringing her knee up into his groin with devastating force. He folded, gasping, and she struck him again, her small fists powered by grief and fury. Within minutes, all 6 men were subdued, bound with ropes that Benjamin had prepared, their weapons removed and tossed into the corner. They were dragged, shoved, and carried to their chairs around the dining table, positioned as though the dinner were continuing. The ropes that secured them were tight enough to prevent movement but not tight enough to cut off circulation. Samuel wanted them conscious for what came next. He wanted them to understand, to experience every moment of what their victims had endured. The enslaved people who had participated in the attack now filled the dining room, perhaps 20 in total, others waiting outside. Moses lit additional candles, ensuring the scene would be clearly visible. Charlotte brought water and cloths to clean the blood from Grace's arm. Daniel stood guard at the doors, watching for any approach from the quarters or outbuildings, though the rest of the enslaved population had been warned to stay in their cabins, to hear nothing and see nothing, to maintain the fiction of innocence that might save them when the authorities came. Samuel went to the kitchen and returned carrying a canvas bag that clinked with the weight of iron. He set it on the table among the remains of the dinner, plates pushed aside to make room. Then he reached in and withdrew the first slave bit. It had been modified, exactly as he had described during the planning sessions. The iron tongue that normally pressed flat against the wearer's tongue had been extended, lengthened to nearly 6 inches and tapered to a blunt point. The frame was heavier, reinforced to withstand the hammer blows that would drive the device home. The leather straps remained, because the symbolism required completeness. The masters locked into the instruments of their cruelty just as they had locked their victims. Jeremiah's eyes widened as he understood. He tried to speak, to threaten, or beg or command, but the gag in his mouth prevented articulation. Samuel approached him slowly, the bit held in both hands, and leaned close enough for his words to be clearly heard. "You have silenced us with these for generations. You have filled our mouths with iron and called it discipline. You have watched us choke and bleed and die with these instruments, and you felt nothing but satisfaction. Tonight, you will learn what silence truly means." He forced the bit into Jeremiah's mouth, the iron tongue sliding over the master's tongue, positioning it carefully. The frame locked around the head, the straps buckled tight. Then Samuel stepped back and withdrew a heavy blacksmith's hammer from the bag. Grace moved forward. Her right to strike first had been agreed upon, her loss the greatest, her pain the deepest. She took the hammer, its weight familiar from years of hard labor, and positioned herself before Jeremiah. She looked into his eyes, wanted him to see her face, to remember her daughter, to understand exactly why this was happening. Then she swung. The hammer struck the back of the bit's tongue with precise force, driving the iron deeper into Jeremiah's mouth. His scream was muffled by the metal, coming out as a wet, choked gurgle. Blood filled his mouth instantly, pouring from torn tissue and shattered teeth. Grace struck again, and again, each blow methodical, controlled, driving the iron through the soft palate and into the skull cavity beyond. Jeremiah's body convulsed against the ropes, his eyes bulging, his hands clawing uselessly at the chair arms. Gray struck until Samuel gently took the hammer from her hands, until Jeremiah's movements had stilled to occasional twitches, until the light in his eyes had dimmed to a blank, dying stare. Then she stepped back, her face wet with tears but her expression fierce with savage satisfaction. Benjamin took the hammer next, approaching Thaddeus with the same deliberate care. The eldest Holloway's son thrashed against his bonds, making sounds behind his gag that might have been pleas or curses. Benjamin positioned the second modified bit, locked it in place, and swung with all the strength earned from 15 years in the cotton fields. The iron drove deep, and Thaddeus's scream echoed his father's, a harmony of agony that filled the dining room like a terrible symphony. One by one, they worked around the table. Moses took Cornelius, his elderly hand surprisingly steady as he drove iron through the jaw of the man who had struck him that afternoon. Charlotte took David Crawford, whispering words about 3 days in the sun as the hammer fell. Daniel, young and shaking but determined, took Nathaniel Webb. And Samuel himself took Edmund Grimshaw, the last and perhaps the most brutal of the overseers. When it was finished, all 6 men sat around the table in their assigned places, the modified bits locked in their mouths, the iron tongues driven deep into their skulls. Blood covered the table surface, dripped onto the oriental rug, pooled beneath the chairs. The men were dying, some already gone, others twitching through their final moments. Their eyes remained open, staring at nothing, the terror and incomprehension frozen on their faces. Samuel surveyed the scene with grim satisfaction. This was justice, terrible and absolute. This was the voice of the silenced, speaking through iron and blood. This was the answer to generations of cruelty, delivered with the same methodical precision that had been used against them. Outside, the September night was thick with insect song. Inside, the dining room held only the sounds of dying men and the heavy breathing of their executioners. The enslaved people stood for a moment in collective witness, then began to move with practiced efficiency. They had planned for this moment, and knew what came next. They gathered supplies from the main house, took money from Jeremiah's safe, collected weapons and tools and provisions for travel. They moved through the quarters, gathering those who had agreed to flee, leaving behind those too frightened or too old to attempt the journey north. By midnight, they were ready. Samuel led them into the darkness, following paths he had mapped during months of careful observation, moving toward the Savannah River and the networks of safe houses whispered about in spirituals. Behind them, the Holloway Plantation stood silent except for the flies already gathering around the dining room windows, drawn by the scent of blood and death. The masters sat in their places, hosting their final dinner, their mouths filled with iron, their silence absolute and eternal. The night of reckoning has come to Holloway Plantation, and the masters have learned what their instruments of torture truly feel like. But what happens next? Will the fleeing enslaved people find freedom, or will they face the full force of the law? Drop a comment with your thoughts on what should happen, then make sure you're subscribed because the final chapter reveals the fate of those who dared to claim their freedom through the most terrible justice imaginable. The journey north began under a moonless sky, 23 souls moving through the Georgia wilderness with the silent coordination of those who had nothing left to lose. Samuel led them, his blacksmith's knowledge of the plantation's iron tools now applied to navigation, following the North Star that hung like a promise above the tree line. Benjamin walked rear guard, ensuring no one fell behind, his field workers' endurance making him ideal for the position. Moses, despite his age, moved with surprising speed, his decades of careful observation having mapped every path and landmark within 20 miles of the plantation. Grace carried a small bundle that contained her daughter's few possessions, the only memorial she could give the child. Charlotte limped on her damaged jaw but refused assistance. Daniel helped the elderly and children, his youth making him strong enough to carry those who faltered. They followed the Savannah River north, staying in the wooded areas that lined its banks, avoiding roads and settlements. The river would lead them toward Augusta, and from there they would follow the network of safe houses that abolitionists maintained, moving from station to station on an underground railroad whose existence was whispered about in spirituals and coded conversations. It was dangerous, perhaps impossible, but the alternative was death by hanging if they were caught, so they moved with desperate determination. By dawn of September 2, they had covered nearly 15 miles, putting crucial distance between themselves and the plantation. They rested during daylight hours, hidden in dense thickets, taking turns sleeping while others kept watch. Samuel rationed the supplies they had taken, calculating how long they could travel before needing to find more food. Moses shared his knowledge of edible plants, pointing out roots and berries that could supplement their provisions. They spoke little, conserving energy, but the sense of purpose that bound them was stronger than any chain had ever been. Meanwhile, at Holloway Plantation, Sheriff Augustus Marsh was beginning his investigation into the scene that would haunt him for the rest of his days. He had arrived at mid-morning on September 2, summoned by the terrified Percival Whitmore, and what he found defied comprehension. The methodical arrangement of the bodies, the symbolic use of the slave bits, the complete absence of the enslaved population, all of it spoke to planning and coordination that challenged every assumption about slave revolts. This had not been spontaneous violence born of sudden rage. This had been calculated justice, executed with precision. Marsh sent Deputy Newcomb to Milledgeville to alert the militia and request assistance. Within hours, riders spread across the county, carrying news of the Holloway massacre and demanding immediate action. Plantation owners gathered in emergency meetings, their faces pale with the realization that what had happened at Holloway could happen anywhere. The system they had believed unshakable suddenly seemed fragile, vulnerable to the rage of those they had oppressed. Posses formed quickly, armed men on horseback scouring the countryside for the fugitives. Dogs were brought in, though the trail was already 2 days old and the recent rains had washed away much of the scent. Rewards were posted, substantial sums offered for information leading to capture. The machinery of slave state justice moved with brutal efficiency, determined to make an example that would discourage any future uprisings. But Samuel had planned well. The group moved in dispersed patterns, sometimes together, sometimes splitting into smaller units that would reunite at predetermined locations. They used the river to mask their scent, wading through shallows when necessary. They traveled primarily at night, resting during the day in locations Moses identified as too remote for casual search parties. And they had help, though they did not always know its source. A barn door left unlocked. A cache of food discovered in a hollow tree. A ferryman who looked the other way while they crossed a tributary. The Underground Railroad was real, maintained by Quakers and free black people and sympathetic whites who risked everything to help the enslaved reach freedom. The network was coded and secretive, but those who knew how to look for the signs could find assistance. A particular quilt pattern hanging on a porch. A lantern in a window. A mark carved into a fence post. Samuel had learned these signs from whispered conversations over the years, and now he put that knowledge to use. On September 10, the first members of the group reached the Tennessee border. They had traveled nearly 200 miles in 9 days, an extraordinary feat that spoke to their desperation and determination. But the authorities were closing in. Militia units from multiple counties had coordinated their search, and informants had reported sightings of a large group of fugitives moving north. The capture came on September 14, in a wooded area 15 miles south of Knoxville. A patrol spotted campfire smoke at dawn and surrounded the location before the fugitives could scatter. 3 of the group were taken: Caleb Stone, a field worker in his 30s who had participated in the revolt, Ruth Whitfield, a woman of 45 who had helped bind the masters, and Isaac Drummond, a young man of 20 who had stood guard during the attack. The 3 were transported back to Georgia in chains, their fate already determined. Public executions were scheduled for September 25 in Milledgeville, intended as a warning to any enslaved person who might harbor thoughts of rebellion. The hangings drew hundreds of spectators, plantation owners, and their families watching as the condemned were led to the gallows. Caleb, Ruth, and Isaac faced their deaths with dignity, refusing to name their accomplices, their silence in death as absolute as the silence they had imposed on their masters. But the remaining 20 members of the group, including Samuel, Benjamin, Moses, Charlotte, Grace, and Daniel, evaded capture. They reached Ohio in early October, crossing the river under cover of darkness with the assistance of abolitionists who risked federal prosecution under the Fugitive Slave Act. From Ohio they moved to Pennsylvania, and from there some continued to Canada while others settled in free black communities in northern states. Samuel eventually reached Toronto, where he opened a blacksmith shop and lived under a new name until his death in 1871. He never spoke publicly about the Holloway Revolt, but those who knew him recognized the careful, methodical quality of his work, the precision of a man who understood exactly how much force was required to drive iron through resistance. Benjamin settled in Philadelphia, where he joined the abolitionist movement and helped other fugitives find freedom. He learned to read and write, skills he had been denied all his life, and spent his final years writing down the stories of those who had escaped bondage, ensuring their testimonies would not be lost to history. Moses found work as a butler in Boston, his skills honed through decades of service making him valuable in ways that did not involve enslavement. He lived quietly, attended church regularly, and donated portions of his wages to organizations that purchased the freedom of enslaved people. Charlotte opened a restaurant in Cleveland, her damaged jaw no impediment to her cooking skills. She became known for her cornbread, though she never explained why she refused to make the particular recipe she had perfected on Holloway Plantation. Grace remarried and had 3 more children, raising them in freedom and telling them stories about their sister who had died for the crime of curiosity. She kept Naomi's few possessions in a wooden box and, on the anniversary of her daughter's death, would sit alone with those items and remember. Daniel became a conductor on the Underground Railroad, his youth and energy making him ideal for the dangerous work of guiding fugitives north. He saved dozens of lives before the Civil War ended the need for such networks, and he lived to see the 13th Amendment abolish slavery across the nation. The official records of the Holloway Revolt were sanitized almost immediately. Newspapers reported a slave uprising swiftly put down by authorities, with no mention of the gruesome manner in which the masters had died. The plantation itself was abandoned, considered cursed by superstitious locals. Neighboring planters divided its land and auctioned its remaining assets. Within a decade, the main house had collapsed, reclaimed by Georgia wilderness, vines growing through empty windows and trees pushing through rotted floorboards. But stories persisted in whispered conversations among the enslaved throughout the South. Stories about a plantation where masters were found with iron in their jaws, where the silenced had spoken through instruments of torture turned to instruments of justice. The tales grew with retelling, acquiring mythic qualities, becoming cautionary warnings for cruel masters and inspirational legends for those who dreamed of freedom. Sheriff Augustus Marsh never forgot what he had seen in that dining room. He served as sheriff for another 12 years, but something had changed in him that September morning. He became known for treating all people with a measure of dignity rare in his position, for questioning the systems that created such horror. He never spoke publicly about his thoughts on the Holloway case, but in private journals discovered after his death in 1862, he wrote extensively about justice and complicity, about the difference between law and morality, about the terrible arithmetic of violence that begets violence. The Holloway name disappeared from Georgia records within a generation. No monuments marked their graves. No historical societies preserved their legacy. They became footnotes, cautionary tales, examples of what happened when cruelty was pushed too far. But in certain communities, in certain families descended from those who survived, the story of September 1, 1844, was remembered and retold. Not as a celebration of violence, but as a testament to the limits of human endurance, the moment when submission transformed into resistance, when silence became the loudest scream imaginable. The slave bits that killed the Holloway masters were never recovered. Some claimed they were taken north as grim trophies. Others suggested they were buried in unmarked locations, too terrible to preserve. But the truth was simpler and more symbolic. Samuel had thrown them into the Savannah River during the escape, watching them sink into dark water, returning instruments of torture to the earth that had provided the iron for their creation. The story ends not with triumph but with survival, not with justice perfectly served but with freedom imperfectly claimed. The price was terrible on all sides, the moral calculations impossible to balance. But those who fled into that September night chose to pay that price, chose to risk everything for the possibility of living as human beings rather than property, chose to ensure that their children would never wear iron in their mouths or chains on their limbs. History would eventually vindicate their choice, though it took a civil war and 600,000 deaths to do so. But on that September night in 1844, they did not know what history would bring. They knew only that they had reached the breaking point, that no punishment could be worse than the lives they were leaving behind, and that sometimes the only response to unspeakable cruelty is equally unspeakable justice. The Holloway Plantation returned to wilderness, but the story of what happened there echoed through generations, a reminder that silence enforced through violence will eventually be answered with violence, that iron driven into mouths will eventually be driven into the mouths of those who wielded it, and that the arc of justice, though long and terrible, eventually bends toward those who refuse to remain silent. The story of the Holloway Revolt is one that history tried to bury, but the echoes remain in whispered tales and family legends passed down through generations. If this dark chapter of hidden history moved you, disturbed you, or made you think about the true cost of injustice, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Share your thoughts in the comments below about what this story reveals about the cycles of violence and the desperate measures people take when pushed beyond endurance. And remember, the most terrifying stories are often the ones rooted in the cruelties we've inflicted on each other throughout history. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you in the next haunting tale from America's hidden past.